bien, nous revoilà donc.
We are back on stage for the second day on the Common Good Summit, and we have the great pleasure of thinking about mobilities following the address by the Mayor of Toulouse for the long term. Now, it's a great pleasure for us to welcome Mr. Carlos Tavares on screen. I can see him. On screen is the General Director of Stellantis, and speaking about the long term, we are talking to the first automaker. We have Mr. Christian Gollier, who is the head of the School of Economics of Toulouse, who has worked a lot on the environmental transition, and just like any economist is thinking a lot about these questions. And when we talk about the long term and mobility, there's something which comes immediately on stage, which is 2035, at a time when the European Union will prohibit all cars, thermal cars, fuel-powered cars. So relative to this particular decision, the consequences are fairly sophisticated or delicate. This is why Mr. Ferry, who has just handed over a report to the Prime Minister, was saying that this particular transition threatened to be quite unfair, and he computed in the France Strategy report that moving to the electric required for the poorer classes in France about 20%, to have an investment of about 2 years of income. For the medium classes, it's more than a year. Now, Christian Gollier, does that mean that such a measure is socially acceptable, or is it too hard? Well, the acceptability from the social point of view is very important. It's central in all dimensions, in all sectors of the energy transition. There's no solution which would be simple and straightforward. They're all very onerous in terms of comfort. I'm thinking more particularly of the ambient temperature in buildings, and if we come back to the time of to the question of mobility, this is the bad customer over the last 30 years in terms of decarbonation, because we reduced our CO2 emissions in Europe by 25% relative to 1990, but then the mobility sector increased. We improved, and we thank all the automakers, but we improved the efficiency of the vehicles. But still, there's some rebound effect, and we are crossing more kilometers, so we brought more CO2s than before. So we have an acceptability problem from a societal point of view, because the cost for this particular sector, the decarbonation cost, is very severe. We had a report from France Strategy 2021-22 saying that per tons of saved CO2, the move towards the electric car will represent a cost of about 250 or 350, 450 euros per ton. Compared to other sectors, if I take, for example, the replacements of coal to natural gas to produce electricity, it would be about 30 or 50 euros per ton. So you can see in the short term it's better to decarbonate, to remove the CO2 and to remove the intensity of carbon in the electricity that we produce. But of course, this is an essential element, so that the electric car would be interesting in terms of decarbonation of the sector. However, the important point here is that the costs are important, and also acceptability is a major factor. In this automotive sector is very important. And I remember when I was very young, I used to go with my dad at the exhibition, the Brussels exhibition, and we had a car, and we used to say that my car was my freedom. We can see in the yellow vest movement, if you are touching the car, it's a very, very touchy subject. By 2035, we are going to forbid the sales of these thermal cars, it seems to be very nice, but then it will not be all that easy because, yes, precisely, because it's not only a matter of social acceptability, but I turn towards Mr. Carlos Tavares. There's also the acceptability from a commercial point of view, because we have mentioned many times that the electric cars are 50% more expensive, and don't you think there will be some rebellion on the part of the customers? And we can see in a survey that we made in Challenge that it's about 1 customer out of 5 who would be ready to move to the electric car. Tavares, you have the floor. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for welcoming me to this particular debate, which I think is very interesting. So there are many points that have been invoked just a minute ago, and I do share all the things that you have said. The freedom of movement is absolutely essential to the life of our own modern democracies. So we consider that our raison d'etre at Stellantis is to bring some solutions that would be clean, affordable, in order to protect the freedom of movement. And this is our raison d'etre, and we do believe that if you attack this for our citizens, and particularly those who would have the lowest economic means, is not reasonable in itself. And so here we are providing all our scientific and industrial power in order to do some research, to find some solutions that will be clean, affordable, in order to protect this freedom. I do agree with this. However, what we have here is that there's some form of autism going on with what has been said, in particular about a few minutes ago. These are things that we've been saying for at least 5 years. So it's about for the last 5 years. And we have been explaining what has just been said. And I can see, with some bitterness, however, that we have some reports of entities that are considered as credible, whereas we are not, and which bring us back to what we have been saying for the last 5 years. I take the positive side. Yes, that's great that at least for now they understand the nature of the problem which is posed, and this a dogmatic approach in order to solve a problem that we will have to solve anyway. So I do agree with what has just been said, and the Senate's inquiry showing that most drivers are rejecting it. They ignore the fact that most of us are using our own vehicle to go and work. Are we going to criticize those who are going to work using their cars? This is the main topic. How do we solve this particular problem? How you're going to solve this? Definitely, the customers would move, given the cost that we have that is incurred between the thermal and the electric vehicle. Do you have the means to lower these costs? And we'll talk with Christian Gaulier about the possible subsidies. Now, I just would like to tell the audience you can always ask questions to Mr. Tavares and Mr. Christian Gaulier. We have our QR code system working. Mr. Tavares, are you going to reduce this gap between the electric and the thermal powered vehicle? I'd like to say very precisely one thing. At Stellantis, we have no problems with the prohibition of thermal vehicles being sold in 2035. You have to understand this first. We have no problem with this particular decision. It was made 13 years ago, and I can only welcome the fact that we are given more time to adapt to this particular decision. That's the first thing, and I think it's important to recall this. Now, this decision is not a problem in itself, because it's imposing on us, however, that we should transform in depth and very briefly and violently what we are doing. And I have the privilege of heading a company which is composed of extraordinary people. They do understand the importance of what we are doing, and they are fully committed to do that. And I would have liked all the actors in the society to recognize the efforts, prodigious efforts that have been made by all the employees of the automakers industry, particularly at Stellantis, in order to bring solutions and also to maintain the freedom of movement in an affordable way. So there's no problem with the prohibition in 2035. We are just adapting at an extraordinary pace to this new situation. We have plants for producing electric motors, and we have an electrified plants. We have inaugurated the first gigafactory for the batteries, and we have 12 electric vehicles in the automotive plants. So we are just changing, and the problem will arise from an equation that I would like to share with you. When you look at the total cost of a car, right, and if you look at the manufacturer of this car, when you put it on the lorry, which is going to drive it to the dealers, the car dealer, in this total cost, there are three main factors. You have 5% for the logistics, 10% for the added value, which is of the car produced in our plants, and it's 85% of spare parts that have been bought. So 85% of spare parts being bought, 10% for the added value for the manufacturer, which is assembling the vehicle, and 5% for the logistic cost. Now, if you say, and you said it very rightly, that the cost of the electric technology which is imposed onto us by Brussels, because the rules and regulations are now neutral in terms of the technology, that it has a cost as well. It so happens that this technology is 40 to 50% more expensive than the conventional technology. There's no other solutions than to absorb these additional costs, because all the other solutions are a disaster, socially speaking, or from a term of instability, if you want to limit the journeys and the freedom of movement. So we should absorb 40–50% of overcost, which is a real problem in these decisions, is that there hasn't been among the leaders, political leaders, any impact study has been made to absorb within a few years such as an overcost. So if I'm extremely confident on the fact that our teams will be able to impose to themselves these changes that are needed to do that, you can see that the efforts to reduce by 40–50% these costs will be done proportionately to the three factors that have just been invoked: 85% of spare parts being bought, 10% for the added value, and 5% for the logistics. So again, it's very easy to understand that the effort will have to be maintained mainly on the fabric, industrial fabric of the manufacturers' automobile parts. But there are 14 million employments in the automotive sector, and you know the contribution to the gross national product of this. So this is where you get the problem. Yes, well, we've understood why you are talking about the something which is violent in the transition. Mr. Gollier, we have the cost factor which has just been invoked by Mr. Tavares. There's also the possibility of saying that that the state can provide for this common good, provide subsidies. It has started with electric vehicle, and it continues to do that. But then, after subsidizing as much as it can the purchase of such vehicles, we are also having a greater deficit and public deficit. Does that stick with the common good? Well, first of all, I'd like to reinforce what Mr. Tavares has just said. It's very difficult for a company, isolated company, to have a true decarbonation policy when such costs are incurred. And you should have a European political decisions saying that there would be a prohibition by 2035. This can be discussed. We can talk about the optimality of this particular strategy, but then it's quite clear, and as a result, all the automakers are on the same line, on the same starting line, if I may say. So this is a good thing in itself. Now, as well, the additional cost will lead to other technological issues, and this is something which will lead to an increase in the prices. So the social aspect is important, but the electric vehicle will be costing much more than the thermal vehicle for a long time. And this, in 2035, will see that the government says you cannot buy this car, which is less expensive, which is more efficient, and which has sources of energy that are less costly. Then the question will arise: can we reduce the subsidies with different premiums? And that remains a true question, because these vehicles these electric vehicles are bought by the most well-off executives. So for the premium, these are very expensive cars, and they will remain very expensive for a long time. So the economists, given the fact that Europe, relative to the United States, is undergoing difficulties to fund all these energy transition efforts, particularly for the households, through indebtedness, because we have a level of indebtedness here which is extremely delicate in terms of the governance of these deficits and the public debt. And we saw that with the euro crisis about 10 years ago. Our capability or our ability to get more indebtedness to support the household is much less than in the United States, because the United States has got a reduction act, which they have an ability to get indebted which is greater than ours. Will it provide good outcomes? I don't know. So, in other words, in terms of social acceptability, it's a problem in Europe, particularly in 2034. If we haven't got a carbon tax which is socially desirable, about 200 euros per ton of CO2, we will have a true social tension, and the second-hand cars are much cheaper. And in terms of energy, it will be, 200 euros per ton of CO2 for a carbon tax. What are the consequences? And that means about 50 cents if you want to. Is that okay to have such a tax of 50 cents? If you remember the Yellow Vest movement, where it was 3 or 4 times less elevated? Well, that's a very good question. However, is it reasonable still to prohibit cars that are much less expensive to produce in 2034? So the solution to prohibit all new cars that would be thermal, it's also problematic in terms of social acceptability. But the carbon tax has got an advantage here. It will bring some revenues that can be used to compensate for the poorest households. So we'll get these incomes, which will provide the monies needed so that we can fight the climate change better, and also fighting the inequalities. But we know that in other policies it's difficult to maintain this carbon tax. So do you believe, Mr. Tavares, that we should have such a tax, carbon tax? What I can share with you is that right now, there's a fragmentation of the world, and there's a reinforcement of the bubbles. We had the American bubble, there's a European bubble, or even the Chinese bubble going on at the moment. And you have to remember that if we listen to what economists are saying, if you have a bubble, the first thing that you are going to create is inflation within the bubble. So you should never forget that over the last 30 years, the purchasing power of the European middle class has been created thanks to the procurement of goods in low-cost countries. You've got the example, which is very well known, of the plasma screens that were all coming from Asia, enabling the Europeans to take advantage of this World Cup or other things like that. And we know that over the last 30 years, the purchasing power of the middle class has been greatly based on the opening of the European market to low sources to low-cost countries, but we've lost a part of our industry as a result. And we can see that this is something that can be corrected. Right, okay, we can correct it. So we say, but how are we going to do that? By creating a bubble. Now, if we create a bubble, there's going to be inflation. So the question comes back right away in our face. Once you've created a bubble which is generating inflation, how do you manage to provide social stability of our populations? You come back to the first place. So this leads us to something which is taboo, which is the competitiveness of the European region relative to the rest of the world, and the will of the European nations to be a competitive place relative to the main world competitors, like the States, because they have a protection policy, and Asia, because of their cost structure, which is better than ours. And so I don't think that creating a bubble is going to create a problem. On the other hand, it does open the door for more demagogic speeches, and it will lead to more inflation. I just would like to respond, because talking about the carbon tax, you can imagine that this is something which will be a factor in inflation, and it will also have an impact on the competitiveness of Europe as a place of production. I'm going to give you a very practical example, which is going to illustrate what I'm saying. Because the electric car, the less expensive car on the market, on the French market, is produced in China, right? This is the less expensive one. It's produced in China. Now, if we have a carbon tax on top for importing this particular vehicle, now the first victim of that would be those who are purchasing this 20,000 euro car. They will pay it a little bit more. This is the first consequence, right? Now, starting from that, now the Stellantis issue is a bit different because we are a global company. We are located very much in Northern America. We're a leader in Latin America. We're number 2 in Africa and Middle East, and also number 2 in Europe. So we are a global company. And we will always choose to oppose the hardest competition because we are a global company. Now, if in Europe we want to protect our mode of life with all the import taxes, whatever the nature, it could be carbon or something else. Now, the first consequence of this is that the middle classes that over the last years have constructed their purchasing power on these low-cost sourcing, the first consequence that these middle classes will be suffering from this inflation, just like the electric cars, which is least expensive, which is produced in China, right? Yes.
Est inflationniste.
So this transition can create and will create inflation, whatever the method. Banning the production of steel by high furnaces and obliging the people doing it to replace it with the green power is going to multiply the price of steel production by 2. And whatever you'll be doing, the result will be similar. And your remark, Mr. Tavares, concerning the introduction of the carbon tax is not really quite fair, because let's face it, we have a kind of ethical obligation vis-à-vis future generations, and we are now some energy sources which are quite available. Let's agree on this. And we have gone through bright years, days, But things will change in the future, hence inflation, and this will have an impact on less privileged people, and that means compensation for these classes of populations. Well, there is something which is hardly tackled these days and which involves car mobility. That is fuel, the fuel issue. There are a lot of ads stating that thanks to electric power, propulsion is cheaper than the other fuel types. Would this reassure you, Mr. Tavares? Would you say that we are going to make the most of cheaper energy sources, cheaper than fuel, gas, the petrol these days? This, of course, brings us back to the balance of public finances. Receipts earnings amount to 40 billion euros and 40 billion euros for France. That's fiscal receipts, fiscal earnings, and they play a major part in our way of life in Europe, in the European way of life in general on the continent. So, to what extent the cost of electricity is going to have an impact on mobility? Where are we going to find this 40 billion euros in France or 100 billion euros in Europe, which are fuel, traditional energy sources related? What's going to happen if we all go for electricity? In terms of mobility, of course. So if we succeed in rebalancing the situation, the usage cost of electric power, of electrically powered cars may become a reality. If I'm right, Mr. Grolier, you're just wondering what oil producer countries will be doing in the near future. Won't they be vying with us in terms of electric propulsion facilities or equipment? Well, we have got a lot of technological uncertainties in the current situation. Quite a lot of uncertainties. There are, of course, several dimensions in the car industry sector, in the electricity production, power production sector, and the weekly issue of the Challenge magazine, French Challenge magazine, is pointing to this. And this week, sunny, when the weather is sunny, is windy, it's okay. You can use the corresponding type of power. But when there is no wind, no sun, what? So what? Question mark. And actually, this has to be taken on board, and so we will have evolution in terms of cost, in terms of fiscal burden too. And you're right to say that there are huge uncertainties concerning the reaction, the way the oil-producing countries will react, and vis-à-vis natural gas production, for instance, coal production. If the Western world really reduces the production of carbonated products, maybe, I mean, the speaker is then opening a parenthesis, if we want to be under 2 degrees Celsius, we will have to leave 90% stocks below the ground, so to speak, or underground. And what may happen if we do things seriously that oil-producing countries will have to sell their stocks because it's too late. So prices will collapse in between inverted commas, or will at least decrease dramatically. And when we look at Saudi Arabia, the extraction cost is very low. And do you mean that transition is thus going to be kind of delayed? Well, beyond production. Let's go back to car use. There are 14 brands manufactured by your company. We have got a service called entitled Free to Move, offered by your company. And what did Free to Move teach you concerning the usage and the use of cars in the near future, or in the future in general? Well, this in fact makes it possible to protect the freedom to move, and this is really crucial to our societies. And after the COVID crisis, we were all longing for returning to previous life and for having our mobility back home, so to speak. And there was a real crave for mobility among populations. And Free to Move offers an interesting asset, actually. And thanks to our hard work, thanks to many studies which have been conducted on this business model, we succeeded in designing a model, a service, which strikes a balance, which is positive, hardly positive, but which is positive. We had 5% of the market, and the market leader in Europe knocked at our door and offered to sell their company, sell now, accounting for 50% of the European market, which had and they wanted to sell, to have it taken over, because they had been losing money for years. As they wanted to get rid of this problem, of course, by selling their company. So we took the company over, and we became the European leaders as a consequence. And what does that mean, actually? Let's face things. Let's be honest. We are in a world in which money is no longer free of charge. So we can offer services, but at a constant, permanent loss. And the increase in interest rates bring us back to the fact that even mobility services, if we want them to be perennial, have to be profitable. This is a lesson we can learn from the current situation. And I just illustrated the situation with the previous example of the takeover of this company, which had losses over years and years. Now, in urban areas, there are other parameters or factors to be taken into account. Cities, conurbations have really to take on board the stealing, vandalism issue, which is a real pain in the neck for car users. So safety is a real issue, but there are other parameters to be taken on board. We have to be very demanding vis-à-vis the conurbations, the city councils, which are always quite prone to getting rid of cars. But let's be honest, they have to contribute in terms of vandalism, safety, security, special bargains or offers, and other types of bonuses. It's not easy. It's not easy to obtain, but it's feasible. And our market share at European level is good, but it has to become perennial. Let's face it. Now let me go back to the use of cars, and I bounce back on Pisani-Ferry's report dealing with the French market. The way well, we are going to use cars differently by 2030. Consequently, the market could have 500,000 cars less. It's a huge figure. So how do you react to this, Mr. Tavares? Don't you think this forecast is quite whopping? Well, it brings us back to the scale of production and consumption change. This change is huge, and let's keep in mind that 2030 is tomorrow morning, and in 30 years we manage 25% of emission decrease. And so figures are just huge. That means dramatic changes in structures in the industry, from the greenest to the less green industries. And let's keep in mind too that electric car production needs less manpower, labor, than the production, manufacturing of traditional cars, so to speak. Do you believe this forecast? In this forecast expressed by Mr. Tavares, I mentioned just a second ago. Well, I already promised my 4 grandchildren that our company would be carbon neutral by 2038. That's done. And Stellantis will become a neutral company because I have promised it. Next, since 2019, and if you take 2019 as a reference year, our carbon footprint at Stellantis has been reduced by 30%. You can check this looking at our CSR data. Next point. If we look closely at the current problems and at the problems lying ahead of us, I would say that the market share should remain around 20% on the European market. I have to vie with the Chinese and plus the usual competitors. The Chinese are tapping the French market. Their cost leading edge is 20%, kind of, approximately. It will be a huge change. But we can reasonably say that we will have 20% of the market share. I was asked the same question a few days ago by some colleagues concerning the impact of all these new trends on employment. Well, I told them, I am telling you, I cannot plan what the car market will be. But I'm telling you, I want and I will have 20% of the market. And of course, I'll divide the results by the number of plants, car factories. And you can try and calculate things. If you decrease your market by that or this percentage, you know that the factory does produce approximately 150,000 cars a year. So it's kind of common sense. But we have got a problem. We have got an issue in Europe. Everybody wants to do what is needed, but no one wants to foot the bill. There is no European will whatsoever, no impact study conducted so far, and you would like the industrialists to do it all and to foot the bill. Well, I try to reckon all this, and it's a real challenge. So you mean, and I just take the French market as an example. You are saying that there should be one factory less, one Stellantis factory less on the French market, for instance, about 100,000 cars less, according to my own calculations. Now, why would we have factories if we do not have to manufacture cars? And now, can we listen to the question asked by someone in the hall to be less pessimistic, actually? This question is referring to the possibility of having alternate solutions, petrol alternate solutions, because you like cars, you like speed, you are a great competitor. And do you think that these fast cars I am alluding to will disappear, will gradually disappear? Would you say that these fantastic speedy cars are going to disappear in the near future? Answer: this is marginal. This is a marginal issue, if not a fantasy. I mean, people can live without luxury cars, without sports car. It's not a real issue. It's more a fantasy, and especially among the French population, and which tends to say the problem is a problem linked or which comes from the wealthiest people. Come on, let's be serious. If we can live happily without sports and luxury cars, we will be doing it, won't we? Let's face things honestly. Let's be honest. Now, going back to the part of the question dealing with the synthetic fuel modes, nothing has really proven, scientifically speaking at least, that they are carbon neutral. And the companies which have tried working on this solution must be in a position to demonstrate that these new fuel substitutes can be affordable. So that's the first point. But let's imagine that in 5 or 10 years, after spending 20 billion euros in investing on electric power, we would find a carbon neutral synthetic fuel. Who is going to pay the price spent by us in developing the electric or electrical car? Another solution actually could be to limit the speed from 130 to 110. What do you think about this? But time is nearly up. Well, I fully agree with Mr. Alvarez. Let's forget about fantasies and dreams, let's say. Sports cars are not an issue in themselves, or luxury cars, but they are a symbol, actually, just like private jets, the way they are regarded, considered, despised, let's say, in France, and or criticized, rather, in France. And let's go. Well, the synthetic path for fuels can be an excellent solution, and can be an excellent for the future. And last year, in light of the Ukraine war, I decided to drive under 130 and not to exceed 110. And I really made the effort, and then I did some reckoning. And the result was that it increases the efficacy of the engines, but you drive more miles with 1 liter of petrol, but you hardly gain that much petrol, and you hardly gain CO2 emission. It's more a social stance, social behavior. But in fact, there is a trade-off, because you increase the time you spend in your car, and this has a cost too, hence an imbalance. So the result is not at all what it should be. And the French president did understand this from the very beginning, because the social cost weighs more than the ecological cost. So, as Mr. Tavares said, let's think of the future, and we do build for our grandchildren. Thanks very much, Mr. Tavares. Thanks very much, Mr. Grolier, for chairing this session, and we will have the next session in a few minutes.